I'm Dr. Mark Bertin. I'm a developmental pediatrician, and I've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of children with ADHD, and I'm here to answer the most common questions I've been asked. Will my child need ADHD medication, and is it safe? ADHD medication is clearly one of the most common questions brought up in this entire field, and honestly, I think the information that's out there is entirely unfair to parents and families and adults living with ADHD. The short of it is that correctly diagnosed ADHD is a medical disorder. That doesn't mean you have to use medications, but that is how we understand the rationale for using medications. Research has been around for many decades, the medications have been used for many decades, and to the best of our knowledge, ADHD medications are incredibly safe and effective when used appropriately. They shouldn't have long-term side effects. They shouldn't change personalities. And I think it's kind of unfair to people that ADHD medications have been marginalized or demonized. The short of it is that no one should use a medication for anything in life that they don't need, but there's nothing particularly scary or harmful about these medications in particular. The research shows that they're beneficial in many ways for many or most people with ADHD. And in the end, my goal in life is really that people just make objective decisions about them and don't get caught up in all the fear-mongering and misinformation available online. What is a developmental pediatrician exactly? Developmental pediatrics is a subspecialty of general pediatrics in which we specialized in the evaluation, treatment, and then long-term coordination of care for children who have various developmental differences. The field actually splits into two different boards, so some developmental pediatricians specialize in what's called neurodevelopmental pediatrics, which are supporting children and families living with things like cerebral palsy. What I'm boarded in, and the other half of the field is called developmental behavioral pediatrics, supporting children who have differences such as autism, ADHD, and learning disabilities. Are my child's challenges because of something I did? The genetics of ADHD are about as strong as the genetics of height. ADHD is never caused by something parents did. Child development issues in ADHD have never been linked to Tylenol, never been linked to vaccines. There is in no way you should be taking any blame for what's going on. Why is my child having tantrums or meltdowns? Tantrums and meltdowns are so overwhelming at home sometimes. It's important to acknowledge, of course, that this is part of typical development for many children. It's really just an expression of their emotions coming out or frustration with a particular situation. But one of the things that isn't talked about enough is at least half of children with ADHD also have difficulty with something that's frequently just called emotional reactivity. And we often think of this as something separate from ADHD, but it's part of executive function and therefore just routinely part of ADHD. So the answer to why children with ADHD have a lot of tantrums and meltdowns is simply that emotionality is part of their diagnosis. How do I get my child to listen when I ask them to do something? Obviously, this is a main frustration for many, many families living with ADHD, and I think I can give a concise answer that really has to do with three different aspects of ADHD you might consider. The first is that anything that improves overall ADHD management can help with listening on the first try. And that includes things like working with a therapist or medication treatment or just anything that helps manage your ADHD as a whole. More specifically for parents, I think this is where understanding the idea of what is executive function in everyday life can be really practical. Because, for example, shifting attention is really difficult with ADHD. And the only way to work with this sometimes is by getting a child's full attention before even making a request. But if we don't have their full attention first, they're never going to listen on the first try. So working with executive function this way and understanding executive function this way can be immensely helpful. And then the third point is that how we manage behavior at home matters a lot. So being consistent in how we make requests, how we support behaviors we want to continue, how we deal with non-compliance, those are all aspects of teaching children to listen on the first try too. Should we get my child tested for ADHD or autism? I think this is a really important question for two different reasons at least. The first is simply that understanding what's going on for any child is vital. So I think if you have concerns, if it's keeping you up at night trying to understand if your child has one of these disorders or if there might be something else going on, it can be really valuable to reach out to your school or to your pediatrician to sort out what type of evaluation might be helpful. The second part of the question that's really important to understand is that there are no specific tests for either ADHD or autism. There's lots of ways to gather information. There's lots of tests that look for aspects of either the executive function issues that go along with ADHD or the social and communication differences that go along with autism. But in the end, when you look at how we diagnose these disorders, it has to do with confirming a pattern of development over time, and there's no specific test that captures that. And by the way, are any of these questions you've asked yourself? Let us know in the comments. Is my child normal? This is such a heartbreaking and difficult question, but in the end, all children are normal. And while it's incredibly upsetting when children are having challenges and exhausting and can keep us up at night as parents, the bottom line is all kids are normal, and what we're looking for are just ways they might need supports or help catching up so they can thrive more easily in life. Is my kid just a late bloomer, or is something wrong? This is actually one of the most common questions I get asked. There is a huge range of typical child development in life, and the range of typical development typically doesn't include chronically causing yourself difficulty in life. So as soon as someone is having chronic difficulty, whether it's socially, academically, it's important to reach out for support and evaluation because so many of the interventions are just about building skills, helping someone get back on track. And that range of typical development, the range beyond someone probably isn't just a late bloomer anymore, is when it's beginning to affect their day-to-day life in some way. What is executive function? Executive function is a cognitive skill set we use for all of organization, planning, supervising, kind of managing all of everyday life. And in fact, one shorthand for understanding executive function, I think, is if you can put the word management to something, it's probably supported by executive function. You have to manage attention, you have to manage projects, you have to manage time, you have to manage your emotions. When it comes to understanding ADHD, when it comes to understanding executive function, it's really important to recognize that practically speaking, if not literally, you can have a child who's many years advanced in many aspects of life, but is up to 1/3 delayed in these specific skills that have to do with managing things like their morning routines or their emotions, and that any skill in life can only improve sequentially. So what we want to do is meet them where they are developmentally and then help them catch up over time. Why doesn't my child play with other kids? I think one of the most important things to understand about ADHD is that even though it's often seen as a school problem, it really can impact almost any area of life. ADHD affects executive function skills, which are your overall life management skills, and those are the skills children are going to use to navigate simple social situations and play. Focus, impulse control, keeping track of complicated storylines in your head, all of these things are involved with any engagement with other children, whether it's conversation or play on the playground. So usually what's happening with children with ADHD when they're struggling to play with peers is they kind of have the motivation and know what they want to be doing, but their ADHD symptoms are directly getting in the way. My child just wants to be on screen all the time. What should I do? The way screens are designed is a complete mismatch for ADHD in many ways, because symptoms of ADHD include things like hyperfocus, easily bored, novelty seeking, losing track of time. All of it creates a situation where kids with ADHD just crave screen time. The most important thing to know is that for any of us who are doing our best to manage screens, a lot of that has to do with executive function. So if your child with ADHD seems like they're too attached to their device or wanting to be on their device too often, one of the most important things to know is that it's not just okay, but it's almost imperative that as parents we decide how much and when is enough, set clear boundaries, and then over time try to teach them to manage screen time better on their own. How to implement these types of boundaries is obviously a huge stress in so many households and difficult to answer really concisely, but I would say 2 bullet points are really important. The first is being very aware of the sort of relationship that you're modeling with your own device and when you're using your own device when you're around your children. And the second is that I've found that the more clearly defined the rules are, the easier it is to get into a routine over time. So when things are open-ended and ambiguous, kids start craving more and more of it and push for more and more. But if for your household you can define a more black and white set of rules of when and where screen time is okay, that does become a household routine more easily. Does my child need an IEP or a 504 plan? I'd like to answer this question in 2 parts. The first is that in terms of school supports in general, it's important to understand that children with ADHD are struggling with this skill set, executive function, which helps them manage day-to-day schooling as a whole. Since skills can only develop sequentially in life, if they're behind right now, we can try to catch them up over time. Their learning is going to be better and their lives are going to be easier if we get them appropriate school supports. The difference between a 504 plan and an IEP is that a 504 plan is more of a medical law, which means that anything medical can't be allowed to affect your education. An IEP is special education law, and these are more frequently things like pull-out services for things like learning disabilities or specialized classrooms. Since the 504 law covers ADHD-related supports in a mainstream setting, that's what's used most of the time for ADHD. But if the impact on education is significant enough, some children with ADHD do benefit from an IEP as well. Does my child need therapy? This is another great question, but I would be a little nuanced about the word need. ADHD care is very complicated and needs to be individualized, and there isn't one answer for every person who has it. Most people with ADHD benefit from some interventions that are non-medical. ADHD affects everything from emotion to organization to planning to time management, impulse control. It can affect health routines. It can be a very wide-ranging. Behavioral therapy, typically with a cognitive behavioral psychologist, can be an incredible support for parents, for children, around emotion, anxiety, self-esteem, developing some executive function strategies. There also is a related field that's useful to know about. It's called ADHD coaching. There isn't as much research there yet, but there's a developing body of research. The thing to know about coaching is it's a highly collaborative field, so it's usually used more in teenagers and adults once they're able to kind of join with the process of working with an ADHD coach. How do I support my child with ADHD at home? Someone who's consistently emotionally supportive over time. So when things get overwhelming and you're not exactly sure what you need to be doing, is if you're just a consistently solid emotional support for a child, that means a lot. More specific to ADHD, I think there's two things to really focus on. Children with ADHD by necessity often get corrected a lot. They're often redirected a lot. So a second part of supporting children with ADHD as a parent is really doing things that help them connect with positive feedback and reward and their strengths, and really emphasizing that over time. And then the third thing is that consistency and routines and structure is part of how children learn to overcome some of the executive function challenges they're having. It's important to acknowledge that a lot of parents of children with ADHD struggle with the same skill set, but still problem-solving ways to develop that type of consistency and routine can be immensely helpful too. What does an ADHD diagnosis mean for my child's future? It's obviously very scary as a parent if a child gets diagnosed with ADHD, and one of the most common questions, one of the things that keeps us all up at night when our children are struggling is, what is it going to mean for the future? Our understanding of ADHD nowadays is that for the most part, people aren't expected to fully outgrow it. And the thing to focus on as a parent, that while the implications of undermanaged or untreated ADHD can be pretty intimidating, really in the end, if children learn how to manage their own ADHD, if their ADHD is treated comprehensively, almost everybody with ADHD can grow up and thrive. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, we actually have a lot more content like this on our channel, so make sure to subscribe. By doing so, you can help to further Understood's mission, which is to make sure that the 70 million people with learning and thinking differences, like ADHD and dyslexia, can thrive.